Tonight, we are going to step back in time and follow the life of a rat catcher. These were the people who walked through old towns and busy markets, keeping rats from overrunning homes, shops, and streets, with small dogs at their side and clever ferrets in their pockets. They searched out the hidden places where rats lived. We will see how they worked quietly in the early mornings and late nights, how people depended on them but also kept their distance, and how some even turned their strange job into a kind of show. In the end, we will see why the rat catcher slowly disappeared from history, leaving behind only a faint memory of a profession that once kept entire cities safe from tiny, restless creatures in the dark. In the quiet folds of history, tucked away in the corners of markets and the shadows of alleys, there lived a profession that most of us have long since forgotten: the rat catcher, a figure both ordinary and extraordinary. They walked the same streets as bakers, tailors, and merchants, but carried with them a purpose less visible and far less celebrated. Their task was to keep the tide of vermin at bay, to stop the endless rustling and gnawing that threatened the food stores, the granaries, and the very health of the people who lived close together in swelling towns and crowded cities. To understand the rat catcher is to wander gently into the rhythms of daily life in a world without modern pest control, when the smallest creature could cause the greatest of troubles. And so, tonight, let us step softly into that world where the sound of small claws in the dark was enough to shape entire livelihoods. Rats have always been our companions, though not by invitation. They followed wherever we went, taking passage on ships, nesting in the cracks of wooden houses, and slipping into cellars where grain was stored. In times when food was precious, when a barrel of wheat might mean the difference between a winter endured and a winter starved, the presence of rats was never trivial. They chewed through sacks, fouled stores, and multiplied with a swiftness that astonished those who tried to keep count. Beyond the nuisance, they also carried sickness. Long before the word plague became etched into memory, people observed that where rats and their fleas spread, illness seemed to follow. Fear of them was real, but so too was the recognition that something had to be done. Enter the rat catcher, a man, or sometimes a family, who devoted themselves to the peculiar craft of reducing the rat population. Not through poisons, as we might think of today, but through skill, patience, and the aid of clever animals. It is easy to picture them walking the narrow lanes at dawn or dusk when the rats were most active. They carried small cages or sacks, sometimes a stick, sometimes nets. But their most trusted companions were not tools of wood or metal, but living creatures, dogs and ferrets. The dogs were wiry and quick, often terriers, bred to wriggle into tight spaces and lunge with remarkable precision. The ferrets, slender and curious, were slipped into burrows or beneath floorboards, where they chased rats from hiding, driving them into the waiting grasp of the catcher or the snap of the dog's jaws. It was a partnership between human and animal that required patience and a quiet kind of intimacy, for a rat catcher needed to know his companions well. He needed to sense when a dog was onto a scent, when a ferret would need coaxing back from a dark crevice. These were not casual pets, but working partners, sharing in the strange, nocturnal rhythm of the trade. The life of a rat catcher was not a glamorous one, but it was essential. In the bustling heart of a city, their presence was both welcomed and kept at a polite distance. People knew they were needed, but they also knew their work was dirty, sometimes dangerous, and never entirely clean. To see a rat catcher arrive in a market was to be reminded of the gnawing problem just beneath the surface. Yet, the relief they brought was undeniable. After a successful round, the stalls of vegetables and baskets of bread could rest a little. More securely, the shadows beneath the counters would fall a little more quietly, and the merchants could close their shutters with fewer worries about the night. In a way, rat catchers were guardians of calm, removing what most people preferred not to think about. If you imagine following one on his route, you would notice how his senses were attuned to small details. A faint scratching sound behind a wall, a scattering of droppings on the ground, a chewed corner of a sock signs, invisible to many but legible to him. He would move steadily, without haste, for rushing rarely helped. The rats were quick, yes, but they were also creatures of habit. By learning their paths and patterns, the rat catcher could outwit them, guiding his dogs to the right places, using ferrets like living smoke to flush the hidden into the open. The work required quietness, patience, and a kind of respect for the adversary. For though rats were pests, they were also survivors, creatures whose resilience could not be denied. Beyond the work itself, rat catchers sometimes became figures of curiosity. In certain towns, they were known not only for their skill, but for the strange trophies they carried. Some kept skins, others teeth, and some even displayed live rats in cages to prove the scale of their efforts. These displays could be unsettling, but they were also a kind of advertisement, proof to townsfolk that the rat catcher had indeed done his duty. And in quieter moments, when the work was done, one might find him resting in the corner of a tavern, his dogs curled at his feet, his ferrets tucked back into small carrying boxes. A man who dealt with the hidden battles most others preferred not to witness. There was also an odd, almost theatrical side to the profession. Some rat catchers, particularly in the 19th century, would perform for curious crowds, releasing captured rats into pits where dogs would dispatch them as a demonstration of skill. These spectacles were not to everyone's taste, but they served to remind people of the sheer number of rats that lurked in their midst, unseen until brought into the open. Yet not all rat catchers sought such attention. Many preferred to move quietly, to be the unseen hand that kept infestations in check without fanfare, blending into the fabric of city life like a shadow. When we think of them now, there is a temptation to shudder, to imagine the smells, the squalor, the scurrying of hundreds of tiny paws. But to slip into the story of a rat catcher, as though it were a bedtime tale, is to notice something else as well. It is to notice the steady companionship of animals trained to a unique purpose. It is to notice the patience of a person who devoted themselves to a task few others would choose. It is to remember that behind the order of a city, behind the bread on a table and the grain in a barrel, there was often someone whose quiet labor made it possible to sleep a little more soundly. And though their name might not be remembered, their role lingers in the unseen balance between human settlement and the creatures that forever follow us. As we drift further into this story, it is worth pausing to think about the places where rat catchers worked most often. Cities in the past were alive with sounds and smells, far noisier and rougher than we might imagine today. The clatter of carts on cobblestones, the shouts of traders, the neighing of horses, and the mingling scents of food, leather, smoke, and refuse all combined into an atmosphere that was never still. Within such places, rats flourished. They thrived in the warmth of storerooms, in the cracks of warehouses, beneath the stalls of butchers and bakers. Where humans gathered in large numbers, where food was stored in bulk, rats found their paradise. And so, the rat catcher's path often led through markets, along riverside warehouses, and into the backyards of taverns where scraps were left out at night. Some towns even gave rat catchers an unofficial rhythm of work, calling on them at certain hours when shops were closed and the streets were quieter. This meant that much of their labor took place in the stillness of evening or the earliest light of dawn. Imagine the lanterns flickering against damp stone walls, the shadows stretching long, the distant echo of church bells striking the hour. In that hushed atmosphere, the rat catcher moved about with his animals, listening and watching for the faintest signs of movement. His dogs sniffed at the ground, ears pricked, tails stiff, while the ferrets waited for their turn to slip into the unseen corners. This nocturnal pattern gave the profession an almost secretive character, as though they belonged more to the world of night than to the day. In some regions, especially in parts of Germany and France, rat catchers were also linked with folk beliefs and curious traditions. There were stories of men who claimed special charms or powders that could drive rats away, a mixture of practical skill and superstition. These figures might have carried small pouches of herbs or muttered quiet phrases that they insisted kept the vermin at bay. Whether such rituals truly mattered or not, they gave the rat catcher an air of mystery. Townsfolk, already uneasy about the hidden lives of rats, were quick to imagine that those who dealt with them must have their own hidden knowledge, too. To some, this lent them respect. To others, it made them figures to be avoided. For anyone who could command rats might also be able to command other, stranger things. England produced some of the more famous rat catchers in recorded history. During the 19th century, as cities grew rapidly, so too did the problem of vermin. Among those who became well known was a man named Jack Black, rat catcher to Queen Victoria. He dressed in flamboyant clothes-bright waistcoats, belts studded with rats' teeth, and even a tall hat decorated with the skins of the creatures he caught. He would present himself proudly at palaces and noble houses, offering his services, and he often showed off his collection of unusual rats, some of which he bred for color and pattern. From this curious pastime grew an unexpected Victorian fascination, the keeping of fancy rats as pets. What had once been feared and despised was, in certain circles, transformed into a novelty, admired for its variety and tamed for companionship. It is a reminder of how thin the line can be between disgust and fascination, and how a rat catcher's trade could spill over into other parts of life. But most rat catchers were not flamboyant or famous. They were humble workers, known only in their neighborhoods, earning a modest living by solving a problem that never entirely went away. Payment might come in coins, or sometimes in food or drink. Some were hired by city councils or guilds to keep certain areas clean, while others worked as freelancers, called upon whenever an infestation grew too great. It was not steady work, for rats might be plentiful in one season and scarce in another. The uncertainty of income added to the difficulty of the profession, forcing some to take on other tasks, strapping moles in the countryside, hunting small game, or even serving as casual laborers between jobs. Yet, there was always a sense that their work touched something essential. In times of plague, when the connection between rats, fleas, and disease became clearer, the figure of the rat catcher gained even more importance. People looked to them not just as controllers of pests, but as silent defenders of health. Even if the science was not fully understood, the absence of rats was felt as a kind of protection. To walk through a market free from their shadows was to breathe easier, to feel that the invisible threat of sickness had been, if not removed, then at least held at bay. Beyond Europe, the profession took different forms. In China, rat catchers sometimes worked alongside government efforts to control infestations, particularly during outbreaks of plague. In India, certain communities became skilled at keeping rodent numbers down in towns and villages, often employing cats as well as dogs and ferrets. Wherever grain was stored in large amounts, whether in silos or granaries, there would be some figure, whether formally titled or not, who took on the role of keeping the balance between humans and rats. It was a universal struggle, repeated in different ways across continents, and the rat catcher was simply the human face of that timeless contest. One can imagine the personal qualities such a profession required. Patience was foremost, for waiting in silence for a rat to emerge could take long minutes or even hours. Courage was necessary, too, for rats, when cornered, could be fierce. Their teeth were sharp, their bites painful, and their numbers intimidating. A careless move could leave a catcher with wounds that easily became infected. And yet, for all the danger, the profession rarely carried the recognition given to soldiers, sailors, or craftsmen. It remained a quiet, background occupation, carried out in shadows, its importance only truly noticed when it was absent. Even so, stories about rat catchers slipped into folklore. The most famous of all is the tale of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a story told and retold across centuries. Though it has taken on the air of legend, it likely began as a memory of a professional rat catcher who promised to rid a town of its vermin. In the story, the town refuses to pay him fairly, and in revenge, he leads the children away with his magical pipe. Whether or not there was truth behind it, the tale reflects something real: the uneasy relationship between townsfolk and those who dealt with rats. Gratitude and suspicion, need and discomfort, all tangled together in a story that has survived far longer than the profession itself. When we picture these men wandering at night with their lanterns and dogs, it is easy to feel a kind of sympathy. They carried out work that others would not touch, handling creatures most people recoiled from, and they did so with little honor or praise. And yet, their steady steps through the alleys and markets, their patient listening and quiet action made life smoother for countless others. They were part of the unseen machinery of city life, one more gear in the great wheel that kept towns turning. Without them, food would spoil more quickly, disease might spread more freely, and the comfort of sleep might be broken by the constant rustle of tiny claws in the dark. The day of a rat catcher rarely began with the rising sun. His work belonged more to shadows than to daylight. Yet, even so, he stirred from his bed earlier than most. In a small, simple room, sometimes just a rented corner above a tavern or a shared attic, would rise with the first hint of morning gray. The streets outside were still quiet. but faint sounds of life already drifted in. The clatter of a milk cart, a rooster calling from some far courtyard, the sigh of a city waking slowly from its dreams. Before anything else, the rat catcher checked on his animals. In one corner, a cage held his terrier, a wiry little dog bred to be fearless in dark corners. The terrier's eyes would brighten at the sound of movement, tail thumping against the wooden crate. In another cage, perhaps tucked carefully under cloth, rested the ferrets. These slender creatures, all curiosity and nervous energy, twitched and stretched when the cloth was lifted away. The rat catcher knew that without these companions, his work would be nearly impossible. So he fed them, stroked their fur, checked their health with the practiced care of someone who relied on them every day. Once the animals were ready, he packed his tools. A simple satchel or leather bag carried small nets, sacks made of coarse cloth, and sometimes wooden cages to hold whatever he caught. A lantern was essential, though in daytime it might stay unlit until dusk. Many rat catchers carried a sturdy stick-knot as a weapon, but as a probe to tap against barrels and walls, to stir piles of straw, or to drive rats from their hiding places. Everything he carried was practical, worn from years of use. These were not tools of glamour, but of quiet, necessary labor. When the rat catcher stepped into the street, the city was already shifting from stillness to life. Shopkeepers opened shutters, vendors began setting up stalls, and smoke curled from chimneys where bread and porridge were being made. People greeted one another, but often the rat catcher was passed with a nod rather than a smile. His work was needed, but not always welcomed. Many considered his trade unpleasant, something best kept at arm's length. Yet those same people, when troubled by scurrying sounds in their cellars or gnawed holes in their grain sacks, would send quickly to fetch him. The first stops of the day were often taverns and inns. These places, always full of food and drink, attracted rats in endless numbers. The rat catcher would speak quietly with the innkeeper, who might grumble about noises in the walls or droppings found behind barrels. Then, with his lantern in one hand and the terrier at his heels, the rat catcher would move into the dim cellars. He would tap barrels gently, listening for the faint scratch of claws within. At times, he would release one of his ferrets into a dark hole, waiting patiently for the sudden squeals and scrabbling of rats flushed into the open, where the terrier would leap with quick precision. It was slow, steady work. No sudden rushes, no hurried movements. The rat catcher knew that patience mattered most. Rats were clever creatures, suspicious and quick. They lived in the shadows and corners where most people did not want to look. And so he moved carefully, lantern light flickering across walls, waiting, listening, and guiding his animals with soft whistles and claps. By late morning, the rat catcher might carry with him a sack heavy with his catch. Some would be killed on the spot by the terrier. Others, still alive, were placed in cages or cloth sacks. In some towns, he could sell them to those who ran rat pitscrim arenas, where people bet on how many rats a dog could kill in a set time. Though such spectacles might seem cruel today, in the past they drew eager crowds. For the rat catcher, it was another way to earn coin from his day's work. After the taverns, the rat catcher turned toward markets. Here, among the stalls of grain, fruit, and meat, rats thrived. They gnawed through sacks, spoiled food, and scurried across wooden beams. Vendors watched carefully, and when a rat was spotted, the rat catcher was quickly called over. He might crawl beneath a stall, lantern casting shadows against the cobbles, and send in a ferret to drive the rat into his waiting hands or nets. The vendors paid him in small coins, or sometimes with food, a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, or a mug of ale, to keep him moving through the day. The afternoon passed in this rhythm of search, wait, and catch. Children often followed him, curious to see the animals at work, though their mothers soon called them away. Some feared that even standing near the rat catcher might bring bad luck. Yet to others, he was a quiet figure of reassurance, proof that the gnawing sounds in the night would be dealt with. As daylight began to fade, the rat catcher's steps carried him once more into quieter alleys. Here, where waste collected and drains overflowed, rats were thickest. It was dangerous work, crawling near filth, where a bite could fester into fever. Yet still he pressed on, lantern now glowing against the gathering dusk. His terrier darted forward with unshaken courage, and the ferrets slipped into cracks where no man's hand could reach. By nightfall, the rat catcher returned home with the day's catch. He set aside the cages, gave food and water to his animals, and counted his earnings. Some nights, there was enough for a hot meal and a mug of ale. Other nights, little more than bread and broth. But always, the city slept a little easier because of his quiet labor. And so the rat catcher's day ended much as it began, with care for his companions, the faithful dog and the tireless ferrets, and with the simple comfort of knowing that tomorrow, when the city woke again, his work would still be waiting in the shadows. The rat catcher's craft depended not only on courage and patience, but also on the humble collection of tools he carried with him. None were grand or finely made, yet each held its purpose, shaped by years of quiet use. To step into his work without them would have been as unthinkable as a sailor leaving port without rope or sail. At the heart of his trade was the lantern. In crowded cellars, damp tunnels, and narrow alleys. Sunlight seldom reached. A rat catcher's lantern was usually small, often made of tin with a simple handle, its glass pane smudged by soot. The flame inside burned steadily, casting a circle of golden light that swayed with each step. More than once, the lantern revealed the faint glint of tiny eyes, watching nervously from the dark corners of a room. The lantern was not just light, it was reassurance, a way of turning shadows into something manageable, a partner that never faltered so long as the oil held out. Next came the stick. It was rarely ornate, most often just a length of wood cut to the right size. But in the rat catcher's hands, it was versatile. He used it to tap against barrels, listening for the hollow echo of hidden nests. He pushed it into piles of straw or rubbish, stirring them until a startled rat bolted into the open. In sewers or drains, the stick became an extension of his arm, reaching into places he would not dare to put his bare hands. Some sticks were carved smooth from handling, edges rounded over time, as if the wood itself had absorbed the rhythm of countless hunts. The bag or sack was another constant companion, made of coarse cloth, sometimes patched again and again. It carried the day's catch. The sound of a rat moving within, scratching faintly at the woven fibers, was one the rat catcher knew well. To keep the animals from chewing their way free, some sacks were lined with wire mesh or leather patches. The bag, simple though it seemed, was also a measure of the day's work. A heavy sack meant food on the table, while an empty one meant thin meals and unpaid rent. For live capture, cages were used. These were wooden or metal, fitted with simple spring doors or sliding panels. A rat drawn in by bait a piece of bread, a scrap of meat, could be trapped when the door snapped shut. Some cages were designed to hold a single rat, others a dozen. They were sometimes stacked in the corner of a rat catcher's home, rattling faintly with movement inside. To a visitor, such cages might seem unsettling, but to the rat catcher, they were simply another part of the trade. Then there were the nets, less common but still valuable. A fine mesh net, weighted at the edges, could be cast across a cluster of rats driven from hiding. It required quick timing and often the assistance of a dog to herd the animals into place. Nets were easily torn and constantly mended, stitched carefully in the evenings by candlelight. A rat catcher who kept his nets in good order was one who could rely on them in a moment as need. Of course, the most remarkable tools were not made of wood, cloth, or metal. They were living, breathing companions, the dog and the ferret. The terrier, bred for speed and determination, was fearless in the face of teeth and claws. Small and agile, it darted after fleeing rats, pinning them with practiced ease. Many rat catchers swore that their terrier was worth more than all their other tools combined. These dogs became partners, trusted and loved, often sharing the rat catcher's bedroll at night. The ferrets, in contrast, were sleek and secretive. With long, slender bodies and endless curiosity, they could slip into holes and cracks where no dog or man could follow. Their presence sent rats scrambling, forcing them into the open. Ferrets needed careful handling, for they were mischievous and sometimes reluctant to return from their explorations. A rat catcher often carried them in small wooden boxes or under his coat, where the warmth kept them calm until needed. Together, terrier and ferret formed a perfect pair, one to drive, the other to catch. Some rat catchers carried small scraps of food kept in pouches used to lure rats toward traps. Others brought powders or herbs believed to repel the creatures, though such remedies worked more in rumor than in truth. A few kept bottles of strong-smelling oils, thinking that certain scents might confuse or attract their quarry. Whether these mixtures truly worked or not, they showed how even in simple trades, people sought little edges, small secrets to ease their work. All of these tools, when gathered together, painted a picture of a man always prepared. The lantern for light, the stick for probing, the sack for carrying, the cage for holding, the net for sudden swarms, the terrier for the chase, and the ferret for the flush. Each had its place, and each was trusted. When the rat catcher walked into a cellar or an alley, he carried not just objects, but a whole system of quiet knowledge, a way of turning chaos into control. At the end of a long day, these tools were set aside, but never neglected. The lantern was trimmed and cleaned. The stick leaned against the wall, ready for tomorrow. The sacks were emptied, shaken out, and patched if needed. The cages were scrubbed, their doors tested. Nets were stitched carefully where the threads had torn. And, most tender of all, the dog and ferrets were fed and praised, their work acknowledged in strokes and murmured words. For without them, the rat catcher would have been little more than a man with a lantern and a stick, lost in the endless scurry of the city's shadows. These humble tools, touched by countless hands and worn by daily use, remind us of how even the simplest objects can shape lives. They were not things of beauty, not treasures kept in palaces or museums, yet, in their quiet way, they carried the weight of survival. In the story of the rat catcher, the tools are as much characters as the man himself with its role, each with its memory, each with its steady presence in a world that rarely paused to notice. To understand the rat catcher's work, it helps to wander quietly through the old cities where he once walked. Each place had its own rhythms, its own streets and smells, yet in every one of them, rats found a way to thrive. They lived in the shadows of human life, moving through the cracks of walls, under the cobblestones, and along the edges of rivers. And so, in every city, the rat catcher found his calling. London, with its swelling population in the 18th and 19th centuries, was perhaps the most notorious of all. The city grew quickly, faster than its drains or sewers could keep pace. Food markets spilled into the streets, leaving scraps behind. Taverns emptied barrels of waste out their back doors. Whole neighborhoods burned coal, leaving ash piled high near the alleys. In such a place, rats did not merely live. They flourished. They traveled in troops along the Thames, swarming from dockside warehouses into kitchens, bakeries, and homes. When the rat catcher entered such districts, he was often greeted with both relief and embarrassment. Relief that someone might take the pests away, and embarrassment that the problem had grown so visible. In London, the rat catcher was never idle. Across the Channel, Paris offered its own challenges. The Seine divided the city, carrying away some waste but leaving plenty behind in its wake. Markets crowded with butchers, fishmongers, and bakers lined the streets, filling the air with rich smells that drew rats in from every quarter. The narrow medieval lanes of Paris twisted into each other, with old houses leaning close, their beams cracked and hollow. Here, rats could move unseen from attic to cellar, from kitchen to stable, without ever setting foot outside. The rat catcher of Paris learned to listen closely for tiny sounds, the scrape of claws in the walls, the faint rustle in a pantry. He worked in shadows where even lantern lights seemed to struggle, trusting his animals to do the work his eyes could not. Further north, Hamburg was a city of trade, its great port filled with ships carrying grain, salt, and cloth. These ships also carried passengers less welcome, rats stowed away in the holds, feeding on spilled grain and spoiled meat. When the ships docked, the rats slipped down the ropes and scurried into the warehouses. There, among the sacks of flour and barrels of sugar, they multiplied in silence, until suddenly they seemed to be everywhere. The rat catcher of Hamburg often worked along the docks, his dog sniffing at the edges of crates, his sack filling quickly. The merchants, desperate to protect their cargo, paid well. Yet the work was never done, for every new ship brought fresh stowaways. If the great cities teemed with rats, the countryside was no stranger either. Grain stores, barns, and mills offered plentiful food and shelter. Farmers sometimes kept their own traps and dogs. But when the problem grew beyond their means, they called for a professional. In quiet villages, the rat catcher's arrival was almost an event, watched with curiosity by children and spoken of in low tones by elders. He would walk from farm to farm, his lantern swinging, his animals padding faithfully at his side. Unlike the city, where he was just one worker among many, in the countryside he stood out, his role both respected and faintly mysterious. Ships at sea had their own rat problems, and the role of the rat catcher extended even there. A voyage lasting months meant barrels of food stored below decks, where rats quickly found their way. Sailors could fight them off with sticks, but the creatures multiplied too fast. Some ships carried a man who knew the tricks of the trade, who could set traps and train cats or terriers to hunt in the cramped space between barrels. On long voyages, the difference between a controlled rat population and an unchecked one could mean the safety of the crew's provisions. A rat catcher aboard a ship was not only useful, but sometimes essential. Though the details varied, a pattern repeated itself across all these places. Where people gathered, food and shelter followed. Where food and shelter lay, rats found their way. And where rats went, sooner or later, the rat catcher was needed. It was a cycle as old as the cities themselves, unchanging in its quiet persistence. Different places meant different techniques. In London, a rat catcher might spend long hours in cellars, kneeling in damp air and probing barrels with his stick. In Paris, he might climb ladders into lofts, slipping ferrets through gaps in beams. In Hamburg, he might spend whole days on the docks, waiting for the moment when a sack shifted suspiciously. Each city taught its own lessons, yet the core remained the same: patience, readiness, and the quiet companionship of his animals. Sometimes the rat catcher compared his days with those of men in other trades. The baker rose early, the tailor sat by his lamp, the smith worked by his forge. The rat catcher, too, had his rhythms, but his work was tied less to the clock than to the hidden life of the rats. In Paris, he might wait long into the night. In London, he might rise with the dawn. On a ship, he worked whenever scratching sounds kept the crew awake. The city set the pace, and he followed. The presence of rats was not only an inconvenience, but a sign of something deeper. To walk through a city with the eyes of a rat catcher was to notice what others overlooked. He saw where food was left out, where drains cracked, where buildings sagged. He read the signs of neglect and abundance alike. In this way, the rat catcher became almost like a guide to the hidden health of a city. A place overrun with rats was not simply unlucky. It was a place with weaknesses in its walls, its habits, or its care. Through London, Paris, Hamburg, and countless villages besides, the rat catcher moved with quiet steps. He carried the same tools, walked with the same animals, and faced the same challenges. Yet each city gave his story a different shape. What tied them together was not just the presence of rats, but the unseen dependence of human life upon those who kept them in check. And so, wherever the streets grew noisy with the scurry of small feet, wherever merchants cursed at knodsacks or mothers fretted over pantries, the rat catcher found himself called once more. He was, in his quiet way, as much a part of the city as the mason who laid its stones, the watchman who patrolled its nights, or the bell ringer who marked its hours. His was a trade of shadows, shaped by the cities themselves, and carried out with steady hands and steady companions in places most people tried never to look. The rat catcher's work was always close to people's lives, yet he himself remained a figure apart. Townsfolk welcomed his services, but they often stepped back from him in the street. It was not that they disliked him as a man, but that his profession carried with it a quiet shadow, a reminder of things most would rather not think about. To speak too closely with him was to be reminded that rats were never far away, that they lurked behind walls and beneath floors, even when the rooms seemed clean and calm. In the markets of London, the rat catcher might be greeted with nods, a brief word of thanks, or a coin slipped quickly into his hand. The baker, whose flour sacks had been chewed through, might give him a loaf as payment, but rarely invited him to linger. The publican, grateful that the rat pit in his cellar had been cleared, poured him a mug of ale, but asked no questions about the details. People needed the rat catcher, but they preferred not to dwell on what he did, or on the hidden companions of their daily bread. In the countryside, the reception was gentler. Farmers who called him to their barns often spoke with him longer, sharing bread, cheese, or a seat by the fire. Their gratitude was less hurried, though even here a certain reserve lingered. Children might gather in wonder at his ferrets or dogs, yet parents gently pulled them back, warning them not to touch too closely. Rats were thought of as unclean, and by extension, so too were the men who hunted them. Respect and unease mingled together, creating a social place neither high nor low, but somewhere between. Payment for the rat catcher's work widely. Some were paid in coins, especially in towns where merchants needed quick results. Others received food, drink, or clothing, whatever could be spared. In poorer districts, a rat catcher might take his pay in little more than a warm meal or a bed for the night. Though the work was vital, it rarely made a man wealthy. He carried out his duties quietly, satisfied with enough to live on and enough to keep his animals fed. His dogs, loyal and steady, were often given their own share of scraps, a sign of respect for their part in the task. There was, too, a strange superstition surrounding the rat catcher. Some people believed he held a special power over rats, that he could charm or summon them, or that he alone understood their secret ways. Old tales, such as the story of the Pied Piper, lingered in memory. While no ordinary rat catcher played a magical flute, the idea of a man who could drive rats away by his mere presence gave the profession a certain air of mystery. Some even whispered that a rat catcher who was not paid fairly might call the creatures back again. In truth, most rat catchers had no interest in such fancies. They relied on skill, patience, and their animals, not on spells or songs. But the whispers followed them all the same. To some, they were protectors. To others, they were unsettling, their work too close to the hidden life of filth and decay. To children, they were half frightening, half fascinating, a figure who walked with animals, carrying sacks that shifted and scratched. In certain towns, the rat catcher became almost like a watchman of cleanliness. His presence reminded people to be more careful, to keep their food sealed and their cellars swept. He was not a moral teacher, yet his work carried a quiet lesson. Where food was wasted, where waste was left uncollected, the rats would come. He showed, without words, that order and care kept the balance between human life and the hidden world of vermin. There were moments, too, when the rat catcher became a figure of entertainment. In taverns, men sometimes gathered to watch his dogs hunt rats for sport, the creatures released into pits, while wagers were made on the outcome. These events blurred the line between work and spectacle. The rat catcher, who normally moved quietly through alleys and cellars, found himself at the center of noisy crowds. His animals cheered for their speed and courage. Yet even then, when the sport was done and the ale drained, he slipped back into the margins, returning to the quieter parts of his profession. At times, the rat catcher's relationship with his community was bittersweet. He was needed, often desperately, yet rarely celebrated. His skill kept families safe, shops open, and ships supplied. But his work was not spoken of at feasts or praised in guild halls. He lived in the spaces between other trades, never rising to wealth, never truly falling into poverty, but walking steadily along a narrow path of necessity. Still, there was dignity in it. The rat catcher knew his worth, even if others chose not to name it aloud. He saw the relief in a mother's eyes when her pantry was safe again. He heard the gratitude in the quiet tone of a merchant whose goods would now last the season. He felt the weight of a loaf or a coin pressed into his hand with sincerity, however modest the offering. These were his rewards, as steady and real as the company of his dog at his side. And so across cities and villages, across farms and ships, the rat catcher carried this odd mixture of respect and distance. He was welcomed, yet kept at arm's length. He was paid, but seldom richly. He was whispered about, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with unease. A key belonged to the community, yet never fully within it. This balance gave his life a quiet rhythm of its own. He walked the streets with his sack and lantern, with his terrier and ferret, moving among people who both relied on him and held him apart. It was a role few envied, yet one that carried its own strange honor. For in the end, the rat catcher lived not for praise or for riches, but for the simple truth that, without him, the life of the town or the farm would stumble, disturbed by the hidden creatures beneath its floorboards and walls. The life of a rat catcher, though steady and needed, was never without risk. For all the quiet dignity of his work, each day carried dangers that could not be ignored. To step into a cellar or to lift the lid of a grain bin was to open a door into the hidden world of rats, and those small creatures, though quick and ordinary in appearance, were capable of harm far greater than their size suggested. Rats did not welcome the rat catcher's presence. Cornered in a trap or driven from their hiding places, they fought back with desperate energy. Their teeth, sharp and swift, could pierce skin through glove or cloth. A single bite, though small to the eye, often swelled and burned for days. In times before the knowledge of germs was understood, such wounds were mysterious and frightening. Some healed slowly. Others brought fever, weakness, and lasting scars. The rat catcher learned to be cautious. He wore sturdy boots and thick sleeves, not only for warmth, but as protection. He carried his stick not just as a tool to stir and prod, but as a shield against sudden movement. His dogs, brave and eager, took the greater share of the danger, seizing rats before they could leap toward him. Yet even the finest terrier bore the marks of its trade. Small notches on its ears, faint scars across its muzzle, trophies of many encounters. Beyond the bite itself, there was a deeper danger. Rats carried with them invisible troubles. Fleas, ticks, and unseen sicknesses clung to their fur, moving from creature to creature without warning. Entire villages remembered tales of plague when rats and their parasites had brought great sorrow. Though not every rat carried such illness, the memory lingered like a shadow, and the rat catcher bore it daily. When fever came upon a rat catcher after a bite, neighbors watched with worried eyes. Some saw it as fate, others as a grim mark of his profession. Yet many survived such fevers, hardened by years of exposure, their bodies carrying resilience forged through countless small wounds. Still, it was never certain. Every scratch carried a quiet question. Would it fade harmlessly, or would it bring a heavier burden? There were other risks, too, beyond the bite of the rat itself. Rat catchers often worked in places dim and narrow, cellars with low beams, sewers with slick stones, barns with collapsing lofts. A misstep in the dark could bring injury as easily as a rat's teeth. The lantern he carried lit his way, but shadows always lingered at the edges where wood creaked and stone dripped with unseen moisture. Ferrets, though loyal in their work, could add to the hazards. Once slipped into a hole, they sometimes refused to return, chasing their quarry deeper underground. A rat catcher might lie flat, arms stretched into darkness, hoping to coax the little hunter back. In such moments, the line between animal companion and wild spirit felt thin, and patience was as necessary as courage. The work was hard on the body. Bending low, carrying heavy sacks, walking long streets through every season, all left their mark. In winter, the cold stiffened fingers and numbed the nose. Yet still, the rat catcher went about his rounds. In summer, heat in narrow alleys stifled, and the smell of waste and vermin grew thick in the air. His lungs breathed it daily, and though he seldom spoke of it, the weight of it lingered quietly in his chest. For all these dangers, the rat catcher pressed on, guided less by bravery than by simple necessity. It was his trade, his calling, and his means of living. The risks were known, but so too were the rewards. A meal earned honestly, a roof overhead, the steady company of his animals. Each day he measured the balance, and each day he stepped forward, lantern swinging gently in his hand. Children sometimes asked him if he feared the rats. He often smiled, shaking his head, and told them that fear was not useful. Carefulness, yes, and respect for the creatures he hunted. But fear only made the hand tremble and the dog hesitate. In truth, he did feel a kind of respect for the rats, not admiration, but recognition of their cleverness and persistence. They survived where many creatures did not, and they defended themselves fiercely. To underestimate them was to court danger. In this way, the rat catcher lived with both risk and acceptance. He bore his scars quietly as part of the trade. He tended his dogs when they limped, stroked his ferrets when they returned dusty and tired. He washed his hands and his face at fountains or wells as best he could, knowing that cleanliness was its own kind of armor. He learned to sense when a cellar was unsafe, when the air was too foul, when a nest was too deep to be disturbed. These instincts, grown from long years, guarded him as much as his stick or lantern. And yet, in quiet moments, he surely knew the fragility of his path. One wrong bite, one deep fever, one slip in the shadows could end his trade altogether. Perhaps this was why his step was steady, his words measured, his habits careful. He lived always near the edge of danger, but he walked it calmly, as though each day were part of a long and steady rhythm. The dangers of rat catching, then, were many, but they did not define the man. Rather, they shaped him into a figure of patience, endurance, and quiet courage. To the townsfolk, he was the man who walked among shadows, so that they might rest more easily in the light. To himself, he was simply a worker of necessary tasks, meeting risks with steady hand and loyal companions. And so the rat catcher carried on, year after year, bearing his dangers without boast, moving softly through the alleys of his time. Though the work of the rat catcher was rooted in necessity, it sometimes spilled over into a very different world, the world of entertainment. In the dim corners of taverns and the backyards of cities, a curious practice emerged, one that turned the grim struggle between dog and rat into a spectacle for onlookers. These were the rat pits, places where crowds gathered, not for survival, but for diversion. A rat pit was simple in form, yet strange in spirit. Within this circle, rats were released in numbers dozens, and in some cases, even hundreds. Into the ring, a dog, usually a terrier, was set loose. The crowd leaned in, voices hushed at first, as dog and rats met in a sudden flurry of motion. For the audience, it was excitement, a test of speed and skill, and sometimes even a wager. Men bet on how quickly a dog could clear the pit, on how many rats it could dispatch in a set span of minutes. The air was charged with shouting, clapping, and calls of encouragement. For them, it was sport, no stranger perhaps than other contests of the age, though to quieter minds it held a shadow of cruelty. The rat catcher often stood at the edge of this ring, for it was he who supplied the rats. His work in the alleys and cellars filled not only his sack, but also the cages destined for these displays. He carried his animals with care, not out of affection, but because each rat was coin in hand, each one a piece of the performance that would soon follow. The tavern keeper paid him fairly, and the crowd knew his face as the man who brought the creatures they cheered against. In a curious way, the rat catcher's profession gained a second life in these gatherings. He was no longer simply the remover of vermin, but the provider of entertainment. His dogs, trained to work silently in cellars, now showed their speed before an audience. The ferrets, though rarely part of the spectacle, were admired for their quickness and bold spirit. Children peered at the cages, both fearful and fascinated, while grown men raised their mugs in cheer. It is easy to forget, in the comfort of later years, how different the past could be in its diversions. Blood sports of many kinds were common, from bear baiting to cockfighting, and the rat pit was but another expression of this taste. The townsfolk, who otherwise wished rats gone from their homes, found strange pleasure in seeing them confronted openly. Their hidden scurrying brought into the circle of light. The rat catcher himself stood in two worlds in these moments. By day, he walked quietly through alleys, slipping into shadows with his lantern and sack. By night, in the tavern, he was part of a noisy gathering, his work transformed into sport. He did not always stay long. Some rat catchers disliked the noise and heat, preferring their solitary path. Others lingered, sharing in the coins and the laughter, finding in it a kind of recognition that their trade seldom brought. The dogs, too, were changed by this setting. In the quiet of their daily work, they were steady partners, precise and loyal. In the pit, they became champions. Their speed cheered, their movements watched with keen eyes. A terrier that cleared 100 rats in a few minutes became famous among the crowd. Its name passed from tavern to tavern. The rat catcher, in turn, was praised for having trained such an animal, and his reputation spread beyond his usual circle of streets. Not all voices, however, approved of such sport. Some saw in it unnecessary cruelty, a needless multiplication of suffering. The rats, though pests, were still creatures, and their suffering for the sake of amusement troubled gentler hearts. A few writers of the time remarked on the harshness of such pastimes, placing them beside other spectacles that modern eyes view with discomfort. Yet in their day, they were accepted, part of the fabric of entertainment that drew neighbors together after long hours of labor. What lingers in these stories is not so much the spectacle itself as the strange way in which it blurred the lines of the rat catcher's profession. His role as a humble worker, bent to the task of protecting homes and markets, was here transformed into that of a showman, provider of fuel for sport. In one life he was unseen, his labor hidden in cellars. In another, he was visible, a figure whose sack of wriggling rats meant an evening's entertainment. The contrast must have been felt keenly by those who lived it. One night, filled with cheer, the next morning, back to the quiet, solitary rhythm of alley and field. One evening's applause, followed by a return to the silent company of dogs and ferrets, lanterns swinging softly in the mist. The rat catcher knew both worlds, and he walked between them without fuss, accepting what each had to offer. And so, in the story of the rat catcher, we find not only danger and necessity, but also this curious thread of spectacle. It reminds us how even the most practical of trades can, in certain settings, become part of culture and community, shaping evenings as well as mornings. The rat pit has long vanished from our cities, its echoes faint now. But in its day, it was as real as the cobblestones on which the rat catcher walked. For those who drift toward sleep, it is a gentle thought that the world of the past held many shades, some harsh, some curious, all woven into the rhythm of daily life. The rat catcher, with his sack and his dogs, belonged to them all, moving between necessity and diversion, between the shadows of alleys and the lights of taverns. Always part of the story of how people lived and how they found ways to pass their time. In every profession, however humble, there are names that stand out. And in the story of rat catching, a few figures left curious marks upon the history books. They were not kings nor generals, yet their lives were noticed in the margins, remembered for their odd trade, and, in some cases, for the peculiar fame it brought them. One such figure was Jack Black, a man who styled himself the royal rat catcher to Queen Victoria. In the bustling streets of 19th century London, his name was whispered with a mix of admiration and amusement. He wore a uniform of his own design, a striking outfit of red waistcoat and breeches, with a leather belt that carried the tools of his craft. To see him walk down the streets was to see a man who turned his work into performance, proud of the title he had given himself and keen to be recognized for it. Jack Black did not merely catch rats. He bred them to experimenting with colors and patterns, creating varieties that had never before been seen. He was known to sell tame rats as pets, particularly to well-bred ladies who found their delicate appearance curious and appealing. Albino rats, with their white fur and pink eyes, became especially fashionable. What had once been a creature of scorn and fear was, in the hands of Jack Black, transformed into a novelty. A companion carried about in sleeves or admired in parlors. It may seem strange, even unsettling, that the same animal could be reviled in one moment and adored in another. But history often shows us such contradictions. The rat, enemy of granaries and carrier of sickness, was also a creature of resilience and intelligence, capable of gentleness when tamed. Jack Black, in his unusual way, revealed this softer side to those willing to see it. His work stood at the curious edge of necessity and fascination, part of the shadowy labor of the city, yet also part of its drawing room amusements. Other rat catchers, though less flamboyant, were still remembered in their towns. In old records, we find brief mentions, men noted for their skill in clearing great numbers of rats from warehouses or docks. Their names passed along by grateful shopkeepers and officials. They were seldom celebrated in the way that generals or poets were, but their reputation traveled in quieter circles. A farmer spoke of them to his neighbor. A merchant recommended them to a friend, and thus their craft, though rarely honored, was sustained through respect for their efficiency. Stories also linger of those who became almost legendary, not only for catching rats, but for their unusual methods. Some were said to whisper charms as they worked, murmuring phrases that townsfolk believed gave them power over vermin. Others carried curious objects, small bones, amulets, or herbs that were thought to bring luck or to drive rats from their hiding places. Whether these were true beliefs or simply tales woven around mysterious workers, they added a touch of folklore to the rat catcher's image. The Pied Piper of Hamelin, though belonging to legend rather than fact, remains forever linked to the idea of the rat catcher. His story, told and retold across centuries, begins with a familiar task: a town plagued by rats. A stranger offering to rid them of the scourge. Yet, in the tale, it was not traps or dogs or ferrets he used, but musica pipe, whose notes drew the rats into a river where they vanished. When the town refused him fair payment, his melody turned to darker purpose, and the children of Hamelin followed him into the hills, never to return. Though it is a myth, the Pied Piper reflects the fascination people held for those who could rid them of vermin. The story gave the rat catcher an almost magical air. One foot in the world of work, the other in the realm of mystery. And for children listening at night, turned the humble figure of the rat catcher into something at once wonderful and haunting. In quieter corners of history, we also hear of rat catchers who became known for their extraordinary dogs. Tales were told of terriers so swift and clever that they were remembered long after their masters were gone. One such dog was said to clear 100 rats in just minutes, a feat that earned its owner both pride and livelihood. These animals, though they could not speak for themselves, were remembered through the affection of those who worked beside them. Their names passed down with almost the same respect as their masters. In the Victorian age, a new layer was added to these stories. Curiosity about animals was growing, and naturalists and collectors began to look more closely at even the humblest creatures. Rats, once seen only as pests, became objects of study. Jack Black's breeding of fancy rats fed into this curiosity, and in time, rat keeping became a hobby. Clubs were formed, competitions held, and pet rats were shown with pride. What had begun as the work of a rat catcher evolved into a gentle pastime for enthusiasts. There is something soothing in these contrasts. The same animal that scurried in sewers could also sit calmly in a lady's hand. The same man who carried cages through dark alleys could also be remembered as a figure of charm and spectacle. History rarely moves in straight lines, and the story of the rat catcher is a reminder of this. It is not only about danger or necessity, but also about invention, reputation, and even affection. As you let your thoughts drift, you might picture Jack Black in his red waistcoat, striding through the foggy streets of London with his dogs at his heels. Or imagine the quieter figure of a nameless rat catcher, lantern glowing in the early dawn as he makes his way home. Their stories mingle in the soft haze of memory, half fact and half legend, part of a long thread of human life that stretches through both shadows and light. And so the rat catcher, in all his forms, worker, showman, myth remains, an enduring figure, one who reflects the resilience of the people who lived beside him, and the curious ways in which even the smallest creatures can shape the stories we tell. Though we often picture the rat catcher as a figure wandering through the misty alleys of old Europe, the truth is that this profession, or something very close to it, existed in many corners of the world. Wherever humans stored food, wherever cities grew dense, the rat soon followed. And with it came the need for someone to keep their numbers at bay. The names, the tools, and the customs differed, but the quiet rhythm of the work was much the same. In India, for example, rats were both a nuisance and, in certain places, treated with a strange reverence. There is an ancient temple in Rajasthan, the Karni Mata Temple, where thousands of rats live freely, fed and cared for as sacred creatures. Devotees believe them to be manifestations of the goddess's blessing, and so they are allowed to scurry unharmed, eating from large bowls of milk and grain. In other towns and villages, however, rats were unwelcome guests, slipping into granaries and kitchens, gnawing at stored rice and wheat. Rat catchers here often came from families who passed down simple methods of trapping and smoking out vermin, using handmade cages or baskets woven from reeds. It was a livelihood of necessity, carried out with patience and inherited knowledge. In China, stories of rats and their hunters stretch back many centuries. The rat was considered clever, resourceful, and even fortunate in some traditions indeed. It is the very first animal in the Chinese zodiac, said to have won its place by wit and quickness. Yet despite this symbolic role, the living rat remained a challenge in daily life. Ancient records describe methods of driving them from storehouses, sometimes using trained cats, sometimes using snares or simple poisons mixed with food. Professional rat catchers, while not as widely documented as in Europe, almost certainly moved among the crowded lanes of growing cities like Xi'an or Beijing, providing the same humble service as their European counterparts. In the busy markets of southern ports, where ships unloaded spices, silk, and grain, rat problems were constant, and those who dealt with them quietly formed part of the life of trade. Japan, too, had its relationship with these creatures. In the Edo period, when cities like Tokyo, then Edo, grew rapidly, rats thrived alongside people. Households sometimes relied on cats to manage them, but there were also individuals skilled at catching and controlling vermin. In folklore, the rat could be a trickster spirit, slipping into stories with sly intelligence, much as foxes and raccoons did. In this way, the real work of controlling rats became entangled with the imaginative life of the people, adding another layer to the quiet labor of those who tried to keep them at bay. On ships, The rat catcher was sometimes the most essential figure of all. Wooden vessels, laden with food and crossing long distances, were paradise for rats. Once aboard, they could gnaw through ropes, spoil barrels of grain, and spread sickness among the crew. A rat problem at sea was not merely inconvenient, could be dangerous. Sailors often spoke of ship's cats brought aboard to keep vermin under control. But there were also men, sometimes hired specifically for the voyage, whose task was to hunt down rats in the cramped, dark corners of the hold. They used traps fashioned from barrels, nets stretched across narrow passages, and dogs that could chase the creatures through the lower decks. In the long silence of a night at sea, one could hear the scurrying of rats in the timbers, and it was the rat catcher who answered that sound. In medieval Europe, meanwhile, the role was sometimes tied to official appointments. A town might have a rat catcher named by its council, paid a small wage to patrol the markets and granaries. In some places, the same person was also tasked with dealing with stray dogs or with cleaning out nuisances of other kinds. A reminder that city life has always needed those who work in its hidden corners. Even across the Atlantic, as cities in the Americas grew during the colonial period, men and women adapted similar traits, though the profession was not always given a formal title. Records from ports like Boston and New York in the 18th century mention vermin catchers who offered their services for a fee, sometimes advertising in local papers with promises of clearing houses of rats. There were also curious variations shaped by local custom. In some villages, groups of children were encouraged to catch rats, sometimes paid a small coin for every tail they brought in. In other places, entire communities would organize rat hunts after harvest, driving the creatures out of the stubble fields before they could swarm into storage. These were not professional rat catchers in the strictest sense, but they reflect how universal the task was and how widely it was shared across cultures. And yet, wherever one goes in these stories, certain images return again and again. A man walking with a small dog, its nose close to the ground. A basket or cage carried on his back, rattling softly with the sound of captured animals. The glimmer of a lantern in the early hours, the quiet movement through alleys, markets, and storerooms. The work might have been done in London or in Delhi or aboard a ship bound for the Indies. But the rhythm was the same, patient, careful, unremarkable to the eye of the busy passer-by, yet essential to the life of the place. There is something almost meditative in realizing this. Across continents, across languages, people faced the same problem and turned to the same kind of solution. A profession that was never noble, never glamorous, yet one that reveals how similar human needs are. Whether in the crowded lanes of Edo, the bustling docks of Canton, the humid villages of Bengal, or the foggy wharves of London. The rat catcher walked quietly, carrying tools shaped by his own culture, but guided by the same timeless purpose. As you listen, perhaps you can imagine one such figure on a moonlit night aboard a great sailing vessel, the sea stretching dark and endless on all sides. Lantern in hand, he moves through the ship's hold, his terrier at his heels, pausing to listen to the faint scurry of paws on wood. Or picture a man in the markets of Beijing, setting his cages with practiced care, while merchants bargain nearby, the smell of spices and tea heavy in the air. These are moments that belong to no one nation, but to the shared story of people and the small creatures that followed them wherever they went. Rats were never only creatures of the street or the granary. In almost every culture, they also lived in the imagination, slipping into tales, songs, and myths. They were symbols of cleverness, of mischief, of abundance, and, at times, of disease and bad fortune. For the men who hunted them, the rat catchers, these stories lingered in the background of their daily work. Their profession was not only practical, but touched, however quietly, by legend. Perhaps the most famous tale of all is the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. You may remember it from childhood. A mysterious man, dressed in brightly colored clothes, came to the German town of Hamelin, which was said to be overrun with rats. He offered to rid the town of them, and when the townspeople agreed to pay, he played his pipe and led the creatures away, down to the river where they drowned. When the people refused to pay him, the story takes a darker turn. The piper returned, and this time, with his music, he led away the town's children, who vanished with him forever. The tale is haunting, yet also strangely gentle when told in a bedtime voice. The rat in this story are a symbol of disorder, of the creeping chaos that enters a town uninvited. The rat catcher here transformed into a magical piper's, the figure who restores order. Yet the warning within the tale is not about rats at all. It is about the danger of breaking promises, of failing to respect those who do the necessary but uncomfortable work. In this way, the Pied Piper reflects something true about real rat catchers. They were often underpaid, overlooked, or treated as less than respectable, even while they performed an essential role. Across Europe, rats carried layers of superstition. In some places, to see a rat leaving a house was considered an omen of death, a sign that the soul of the home was departing. In others, rats were thought to abandon ships before they sank, their uncanny instinct making them harbingers of disaster. Sailors sometimes watched them carefully, uneasy if too many were seen rushing to leave a vessel. In Old England, there was even a saying, "Where rats desert, men follow." The belief that rats could sense calamity before humans could give them a ghostly aura, as though they moved in touch with hidden forces. For the rat catcher, these beliefs gave his work a curious edge. He was not merely trapping animals, but dealing with creatures tied to fate and fortune. In parts of Scandinavia, stories told of the Rat King a strange, eerie phenomenon in which several rats became entangled by their tails, knotted together so tightly that they could not escape one another. Though rare, such discoveries left a deep impression. The Rat King became a symbol of misfortune and disease, a living tangle of fear. To stumble upon one was to be confronted with the uncanny, something ordinary yet unsettling. In India, as we touched upon earlier, rats held a dual role. While they raided granaries and forced people to invent ways of catching them, they were also sacred at the Karni Mata temple, where thousands of them are cared for and worshipped. Pilgrims travel long distances to see them, feeding them milk and sweets, believing that to share food with the temple rats brings blessings. For a rat catcher, this might have seemed a paradox. Creatures hunted in one town might be honored in the next. Yet it shows how flexible human imagination can be, turning the same small animal into either pest or deity. In China, the rat was a figure of cleverness and resourcefulness. Its role as the first of the zodiac animals gives it a place of honor, even if it was not beloved in daily life. The story goes that when the Jade Emperor called the animals to a great race to decide their order in the zodiac, the rat won by cunning. It asked the ox to carry it across the river, then leaped ahead at the last moment to claim first place. For a rat catcher, this might have been an amusing tale to remember. The very creatures he spent his nights pursuing were, in myth, quick-witted enough to outsmart even the noble ox. In Japan, rats appear in folklore as companions of the god Dakakutang, one of the 7 lucky gods associated with wealth and abundance. In images, rats are shown nibbling at the rice bales near him, not as thieves, but as signs of overflowing prosperity. Again, the rat shifts between nuisance and blessing, depending on the frame of the story. Folklore also connected rats with disease, though often in symbolic rather than direct ways. In Europe, during times of plague, rats were seen everywhere, and though people did not fully understand the connection with fleas, the presence of so many vermin became a dark sign. Rat catchers were sometimes spoken of as men who could charm rats away. Not unlike the Pied Piper, their work edged with a hint of the magical. Some even claimed to know special powders or herbs that would drive the creatures out, though more often their skill was simply patience and practice. Even in the quieter stories, rats slip in as tricksters. In fables, they gnaw at ropes to free friends or steal crumbs from beneath the noses of larger beasts. In children's rhymes, they are sly visitors sneaking about with twitching whiskers. Their image, once feared, often softened in the imagination, making them into characters rather than threats. And so the rat catcher, walking through a village, may have seemed to some like a practical servant, but to others he carried an almost mythical air. He was the human counterpart to the Pied Piper, to the man who tamed omens, to the figure who wrestled with forces both real and symbolic. His sack did not just hold animals. In a sense, it held the weight of many centuries of belief. As we drift with these stories, it is easy to see how the humble rat was never only itself. It was a creature onto which people projected their fears, their hopes, their imagination. Clever and quick, destructive and fertile, sacred and cursed, wore many masks. And the rat catcher, whether he thought about these things or not, was always moving within their shadow. One can picture him on a quiet evening, having finished his rounds. Perhaps he sits by the fire with his dog at his feet, listening to the faint rustle of the world outside. In the flicker of the flames, old tales might come to mind, the piper's tune, the omen of rats leaving a house, the clever rat leaping from the ox's back. Whether or not he believed them, they were part of the air he breathed, the world in which his work took place. In this way, his life was never only about catching vermin. It was also about living in the web of stories that people spun around them. Stories that linger still long after the last professional rat catcher has gone. Every profession has its season. Some last for centuries, unchanged in their rhythm. Others rise, serve a need for a time, and then fade, slipping into memory as the world moves on. The rat catcher belonged to this second kind. For centuries, he walked the alleys and the barns, carrying his sack, his sticks, and his patient dogs. But by the late 19th and early 20th century, his trade began to wane, slowly but steadily, until only fragments remained. The change began with a growing understanding of disease. In earlier centuries, people knew that rats brought trouble, but they did not fully understand how. A scurrying shadow in the corner was unnerving, yes, but the real danger was not obvious. With the discovery of germs, and the realization that fleas on rats carried plague and other illnesses, a new urgency entered the fight against vermin. The task was no longer only about protecting grain from hungry mouths. It was about safeguarding human life itself. With this understanding came science, and with science came new methods. Chemical powders and poisons were developed, capable of killing rats quickly and in great numbers. At first, these substances were crude and sometimes dangerous to humans and animals alike. But as they improved, they became tools that could accomplish in a single night what a man with a dog and a ferret might struggle to do over days. Traps, too, grew more effective. The simple wooden spring trap, with its sharp bar that snapped down upon the unlucky rodent, appeared in the late 19th century and spread quickly. It was cheap, reliable, and easy for anyone to set. Housewives, innkeepers, and farmers could suddenly protect their homes without needing to hire a professional. Where once the sight of a rat sent someone to fetch the local catcher, now they might simply fetch a trap from the cupboard. The growing cities also changed the landscape. Sewers were redesigned, food storage became more secure, and waste management slowly improved. Though rats never vanished, their presence grew less overwhelming in many places. The great swarms that once plagued towns became rarer, or at least less visible. The work of the rat catcher, once a familiar sight, began to seem old-fashioned, even unnecessary. In some places, municipal services began to take over the role. City councils and health boards organized official pest control, hiring men not as independent catchers, but as uniformed workers of the state. The profession that had once been informal, almost folkloric, became part of bureaucratic machinery. In this transformation, the individual rat catcher, known by name in his community, wandering with his animals, was replaced by teams with standardized equipment, reporting to offices and departments. For the catchers themselves, this shift was bittersweet. Some adapted, joining the new public services or turning to modern tools. Others, especially those who were older or more attached to the old ways, found themselves left behind. To carry a ferret in a sack or to train terriers for the hunt seemed suddenly like relics from another age. By the early 20th century, stories of professional rat catchers had already taken on a nostalgic air. Newspapers sometimes printed little pieces about the last catchers in certain towns, presenting them as curiosities rather than necessities. They were remembered less for their skill than for their color, their odd appearance, their strange tools, their dogs with fierce eyes and wagging tails. Readers smiled at these sketches, perhaps forgetting that only a generation earlier, such men had been vital to public health. The decline of the profession also echoed a larger pattern. Many trades that had grown from necessity knocker-uppers who tapped on windows to wake workers before alarm clocks, night soil men who carried away waste before modern sanitation, were vanishing in the same decades. Industrial progress, scientific discovery, and municipal organization combined to sweep away ways of life that had been ordinary for centuries. Still, the image of the rat catcher lingered in culture. Painters and illustrators found him an appealing subject. The lean man with a lantern, the sack slung over his back, the terrier by his side. Writers, too, mentioned him as a figure half real, half folkloric, living on the edge of respectability. In some towns, children would still whisper about him, imagining him as something like the Pied Piper, a man who could summon rats with a whistle or vanish into the sewers with his animals. It is worth noting that even as the profession faded, rats themselves never truly disappeared. They adapted, as they always had, to the new poisons and traps, to the new cities and machines. In a sense, the decline of the rat catcher was not a victory of humans over rats, but rather a change in tactics. The struggle continued, only in new forms. And perhaps this is why the rat catcher remains so quietly evocative. His work was never glamorous, never celebrated, but it was intimate. He moved close to the animals, read their signs, trained his companions, and walked where others did not wish to walk. The modern pest controller, with powders and traps, works at a distance. The old catcher was face to face with his quarry, tied to the rhythms of night and alley. His trade, a kind of quiet companionship with creatures most people would rather not see at all. As we think of him fading into history, we might imagine a last evening. A man in a long coat, carrying his sack, walks slowly down a cobblestone lane. His terrier trots beside him, ears twitching, and the faint glow of his lantern spreads across the damp walls. He knows the city well, the cracks where rats slip through, the barns where they nest, the markets where they scurry for scraps. But tonight, the streets are quieter than they once were. Fewer doors open to call him in. Fewer eyes watch him with a mix of relief and unease. Tomorrow or next year, someone may buy a trap or sprinkle a powder, and his services will no longer be needed. Still, for this moment, he walks in his old way, doing the work he knows, the work his father may have done before him. And in that picture, there's both an ending and a kind of calm. Professions come and go, but the memory of them lingers, folded into the fabric of history. The rat catcher may be gone from the alleys, but his figure remains. A quiet reminder of how people once lived, and of the unseen labor that kept towns safe and homes secure. History often remembers the grand figures, kings, generals, inventors. But when we pause in the quieter corners, we find other kinds of lives, those of men and women whose work shaped the daily rhythms of survival. The rat catcher is one of these. His name is not carved on monuments, his story not told in sweeping chronicles. Yet, his presence once touched countless lives in simple, practical ways. To picture him is to picture an age when the boundary between human life and the animal world was thinner, more immediate. Streets were not clean, food was not sealed in tins, and waste was not swept away by silent trucks. Rats ran boldly where people lived, reminding everyone of how fragile order could be. Into this space stepped the the rat catcher, a quiet guardian of thresholds, standing between people and the scurrying tide of vermin. We might imagine him now, not in the bustle of work, but in a moment of rest. He sits on a low stool in a dim tavern, a mug of ale by his side, his terrier curled at his feet. His sack leans against the wall, still and silent for once. Other patrons keep a little distance, some uneasy at the thought of what he carries, some simply respectful of his odd trade. He does not speak much, but his eyes move calmly, as if seeing in shadows what others miss. He is part of the room, and yet, apart from it, a figure who belongs more to the alleys than to the hearth. Or perhaps we might follow him home after a long night. His boots leave damp prints on the cobbles. The lantern's glow sways gently, casting fleeting shapes across the walls. Inside his modest dwelling, he unties the sack, lets the ferret slip back into its hutch, strokes the terrier's head, and lays his tools aside. He eats simple food: bread, cheese, a bit of meat before lying down to rest. In those hours of sleep, he dreams not of glory, but of the next day's work, the next alley, the next market stall. In these gentle scenes, the rat catcher becomes less a curiosity and more a thread in the great fabric of everyday life. His work is not beautiful, yet it is steady, not celebrated, yet necessary. He reminds us that history is built not only on great events, but also on quiet labors, on those who walked unseen paths to make ordinary living possible. As centuries passed and his trade declined, the figure of the rat catcher slipped into legend. Children heard stories of the Pied Piper and imagined him leading swarms away with music. Painters and writers turned him into a symbol, half real, half mythical. Some remembered him with a shiver, others with a smile. But whether feared or admired, he remained a presence in memory, never entirely forgotten. It is curious how professions fade, yet their echoes remain. We no longer see a man with a lantern and a sack at the edge of the marketplace. Yet when we hear the scrabble of a rat in a wall, or see the flash of a shadow across a cellar floor, some old part of us recalls that such figures once existed, to step forward when called. Their absence makes their memory even sharper, as though the silence itself reminds us of the sound that once filled it. The rat catcher's life also invites a gentler thought about resilience. His trade was not easy, nor was it glamorous. Yet it demanded patience, courage, and understanding of creatures most people despised. In his way, he was a kind of bridge between the world of people and the hidden lives of animals that thrived beside them. Where others saw only filth and threat, he saw patterns, behaviors, habits to be read and worked with. In this, he practiced a kind of quiet knowledge, learned not from books, but from long nights and countless steps through alleys and barns. And so, as we let his story fade into calm, we might hold one last image: a narrow lane hushed in the mist, the faint glow of a lantern swaying, a small dog at a man's heel, ears pricked, nose to the air. A ferret shifts lightly in a bag, silent but alert. The man's boots sound softly on the stones. His coat flutters in the damp breeze. He walks not with haste, but with the patience of one who knows his path. Around him, the city sleeps. Behind shutters and doors, families rest in safety, unaware of the watchful figure moving outside. Slowly, the mist thickens and the figure grows distant. The sound of the boots fades. The glow of the lantern dims until it is only a point of light in the haze. Then it too is gone. Yet, in the quiet, we feel that he is still there, somewhere in the folds of history, walking, watching, tending to the unseen edges of life. And with that thought, we let him pass as we let ourselves drift. The rat catcher, humble and unsung, has finished his walk. His memory remains gentle and steady, like a story told before sleep.